Somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, a Navy pilot in a Grumman Avenger dropped through broken clouds and found himself staring at something that wasn't supposed to exist. A German submarine, fully surfaced, caught in daylight 500 miles from any coastline. For months, these predators had owned the Atlantic darkness. They had starved Britain. They had drowned merchant sailors by the thousands. And now one sat exposed on the gray water, vulnerable, as if the ocean itself had betrayed it. The pilot pushed his throttle forward. He had seconds to decide what to do next. The year was 1943, and the Battle of the Atlantic had entered its most desperate phase. For nearly 4 years, German submarines had waged unrestricted warfare against Allied shipping, and they were winning. The numbers told a story of slow strangulation. In 1942 alone, U-boats had sent over 6 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic. Tankers carrying fuel, freighters loaded with grain, Liberty ships packed with tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and the raw materials that kept Britain alive and armed. Every week, the losses mounted. Every month, the gap between ships sunk and ships built narrowed toward catastrophe. The Atlantic had become a killing ground, measured not in miles, but in graveyards. Convoy routes stretched across 3,000 miles of open water between North America and the British Isles. Merchant ships traveled in formations of 30, 40, sometimes 60 vessels, their hulls riding low with cargo, their crews scanning empty horizons for threats they could rarely see until it was too late. Destroyers and corvettes escorted them when available, but there were never enough warships to cover every convoy, every mile, every vulnerable hour between dusk and dawn. The submarines operated in wolf packs, coordinated by radio from shore headquarters, guided to their targets by signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance. They attacked at night, on the surface, where their low profiles made them nearly invisible against the dark water. They fired spreads of torpedoes into convoy columns and vanished before escorts could respond. They waited for stragglers. They exploited gaps in coverage. They understood that the Atlantic was vast enough to hide in and patient enough to reward their tactics. And for much of 1942, there existed a void in the middle of the ocean where Allied air cover simply could not reach. They called it the Black Pit, land-based patrol aircraft operating from Newfoundland, Iceland, and the British Isles could cover the western and eastern approaches to the convoy routes. But in the central Atlantic, roughly between 22 and 40 degrees west longitude, there stretched an air gap of several hundred miles where no Allied aircraft could fly. Convoys entering this zone lost their protective umbrella. They sailed for days without eyes in the sky, and the U-boats knew it. They concentrated their attacks in the Black Pit, where surface escorts alone could not cover enough ocean to prevent infiltration, where the darkness belonged to them. The mathematics of the crisis were brutal. Britain imported nearly everything needed to sustain its war effort and feed its population. Disruption of Atlantic convoys meant disruption of the entire Allied strategy. Without American supplies reaching British ports, there could be no build-up for a cross-channel invasion. Without fuel, the Royal Air Force could not maintain bomber operations over Europe. Without food, British civilian morale would collapse. Winston Churchill later admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. By early 1943, Allied losses had reached crisis levels. January saw 203,000 tons of shipping sunk. February brought 359,000 tons. March was worse still, with over 600,000 tons lost, much of it in the Black Pit, much of it in convoy battles that lasted days and left oil slicks and floating debris stretching for miles across the gray swells. Something had to change. The solution, when it came, was not a single technological breakthrough or a brilliant tactical innovation. It was an accumulation of improvements, each incremental, each essential. Better radar sets that could detect surfaced submarines at greater ranges, high-frequency direction-finding equipment that could triangulate U-boat radio transmissions, improved depth charges and ahead-throwing weapons for surface escorts, more long-range patrol aircraft assigned to coastal command and Navy squadrons. But the most significant development was the escort carrier. The idea was simple in concept and staggering in execution. Take a merchant ship hull, install a flight deck, add a hangar and aircraft handling equipment, and deploy it with convoy escort groups to provide air cover where land-based aircraft could not reach. Close the black pit with ships that carried their own eyes and weapons into the void. The first escort carriers were conversions, crude by fleet carrier standards, built for function rather than elegance. Their flight decks were short. Their hangars were cramped. Their aircraft capacity was limited to roughly a dozen planes. They rolled heavily in Atlantic swells and offered their pilots minimal margin for error during takeoffs and landings. They were not designed for fleet actions or offensive strikes. They were designed to find submarines and kill them. USS Bogue was one of these vessels. Commissioned in September 1942, Bogue was a Bogue-class escort carrier, the lead ship of her class, built on a merchant hull by Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation. She displaced just over 8,000 tons, measured 495 feet in length, and could make roughly 18 knots at maximum speed. Her flight deck was 500 feet long and 70 feet wide, barely adequate for the Grumman aircraft that would operate from it. Her crew numbered around 890 men, including the air group. By the spring of 1943, Bogue had completed her shakedown and training period. Her air group, Composite Squadron 9, had practiced the specialized skills required for anti-submarine warfare from an escort carrier. They had learned to launch and recover aircraft in heavy seas. They had rehearsed search patterns and attack procedures. They had studied U-boat silhouettes and practiced identifying them from altitude. In March 1943, Bogue deployed on her first Atlantic convoy escort mission. The patrol area was the Central Atlantic, the heart of the Black Pit, where convoys had suffered their worst losses and where the presence of an escort carrier was most desperately needed. For the first time, American aircraft would fly continuous protective cover over a transatlantic convoy throughout the most dangerous portion of its voyage. For the first time, submarines approaching a convoy would face the threat of detection and attack from the air, regardless of their distance from land. The stakes could not have been higher. Every merchant ship that reached port carried supplies that would eventually arm soldiers, fuel aircraft, and feed populations. Every submarine destroyed meant one fewer threat to future convoys. Every successful escort mission proved that the Black Pit could be closed, that the Atlantic could be contested, that the slow hemorrhage of Allied shipping could be stopped. Bogue's pilots and air crews understood what they were being asked to do. They would fly from a pitching deck over an ocean that killed the unprepared. They would search for targets that presented themselves only briefly, that dove within seconds of being spotted, that fought back with anti-aircraft weapons when cornered. They would operate at the extreme limits of their aircraft's range, knowing that navigation errors or mechanical failures could strand them over empty water with no hope of rescue. They were not volunteers for a safe assignment. They were hunters entering a hunting ground that had belonged to the enemy for years. If this history matters to you, subscribe to keep these stories alive. The men who flew from Bogue's deck in the spring of 1943 came from the same America that had existed before the war, a country of small towns and growing cities, of farms and factories, of families who knew little about naval aviation and understood even less about submarine warfare. Most of them had never seen an aircraft carrier before enlisting. Some had never seen the ocean. The officers who led Composite Squadron 9 were career Navy men, products of Pensacola and advanced training programs that had condensed years of peacetime learning into months of wartime necessity. They had logged hundreds of flight hours before ever setting foot on Bogue, but nothing in their training had fully prepared them for the reality of carrier operations in the North Atlantic. The textbooks did not adequately describe the way a small carrier moved in heavy seas, the deck pitching and rolling in complex rhythms that made every landing an exercise in controlled collision. The training films did not capture the isolation of flying over gray water that stretched to every horizon, the knowledge that a forced landing meant death by exposure even if the aircraft survived the ditching. They learned these things the hard way, through experience that could not be simulated. The enlisted air crewmen who served as radio men and gunners aboard the TBF Avengers came from different backgrounds but shared common qualities. They had volunteered for flight duty knowing it carried elevated risks. They had completed training programs that taught them to operate complex radio and radar equipment, to maintain and fire defensive machine guns, to assist with navigation over featureless ocean. They occupied the rear compartments of aircraft designed primarily around the pilot and the torpedo, and they accepted that their survival depended on the skills of men they had not chosen and could not control. The TBF Avenger itself was a remarkable aircraft, perhaps the finest torpedo bomber of the war. Built by Grumman in their Bethpage, Long Island factory, the Avenger was a substantial machine. It measured 40 feet in length, with a wingspan of 54 feet. It weighed over 10,000 pounds empty and could carry over 2,000 pounds of ordnance in its internal bomb bay. Its Wright AR-2000 radial engine produced nearly 1,700 horsepower, giving the aircraft a maximum speed of around 275 miles per hour and a combat range that could exceed 1,000 miles with careful fuel management. For anti-submarine work, the Avenger carried depth charges in place of torpedoes, typically 4 Mark 47 or Mark 54 charges fused to detonate at various depths. The bomb bay could also accommodate bombs or, later in the war, acoustic homing torpedoes. Forward-firing machine guns and the turret-mounted gun in the rear provided defensive and offensive capability against surfaced submarines that chose to fight back. But the Avenger's greatest asset in the anti-submarine role was its ability to stay airborne for extended periods while carrying detection equipment and weapons. Equipped with radar, the Avenger could search vast stretches of ocean more efficiently than surface vessels. Its crew of 3 provided multiple sets of eyes and ears, dividing the workload of navigation, communication, and observation. Its reliability, developed through Grumman's rigorous engineering standards, meant that aircraft returned from missions that would have stranded lesser designs in the water. The men who flew these aircraft understood their machines intimately. They knew the sounds of a healthy engine and the subtle vibrations that preceded mechanical failure. They knew the feel of the controls in smooth air and turbulence. They knew the limits of their fuel, the behavior of their aircraft in various loading conditions, the procedures for emergency situations that their instructors had described and that some of them would eventually experience firsthand. This knowledge was not academic. It was survival. Flying over the Atlantic in 1943 meant operating without the safety margins that shore-based aviation took for granted. There were no alternate airfields. There were no emergency services standing by. There was only the ship pitching somewhere over the horizon, and the skills that each pilot and crew had accumulated through training and practice. The men of VC-9 developed a particular kind of competence, forged in Atlantic conditions that tested every assumption. They learned to launch from Bogue's deck in crosswinds and following seas, timing their takeoff runs to the rhythm of the ship's motion, building airspeed in distances that left no room for hesitation. They learned to navigate by dead reckoning and radio bearings over an ocean that offered no landmarks, no visual references, nothing but water and sky, and the occasional glimpse of the convoy they were protecting. They learned to search in expanding patterns, covering hundreds of square miles while conserving fuel, knowing that every minute of flight time represented both opportunity and risk. Most importantly, they learned to work together. The three-man crew of an Avenger functioned as a single organism when operating efficiently. The pilot flew the aircraft and made tactical decisions. The radio man operated the radar and maintained communication with the ship. The turret gunner watched for threats and provided additional observation. Each man depended on the others. Each man trusted that his crewmates would perform their duties without supervision. This trust was essential because combat left no time for consultation. When an Avenger spotted a submarine, the crew had seconds to coordinate their response. The pilot had to decide on the approach angle, the release altitude, the number of weapons to drop. The radio man had to transmit the contact report while tracking the target on radar. The gunner had to prepare for possible anti-aircraft fire while maintaining observation. Any breakdown in this coordination could mean a missed opportunity or, worse, an aircraft lost to defensive fire from a submarine that had been given time to prepare. The pilots and crews of VC-9 trained together, flew together, and waited together through the monotonous hours of patrol when nothing happened and the ocean remained empty and threatening in equal measure. They were not seasoned veterans when Bogue sailed on her first combat deployment. Some had never fired weapons in anger, some had never seen a submarine except in photographs and recognition manuals. They possessed the theoretical knowledge required for their mission, but theory and experience were different things, and the Atlantic would provide the experience they lacked. What they brought to the mission was something less tangible but equally important. They brought willingness. They were prepared to fly into conditions that would have been considered unacceptable in peacetime operations. They were prepared to attack targets that could fight back. They were prepared to risk their lives repeatedly over months of deployment, knowing that each mission could be their last, knowing that the ocean kept its own accounting of men who made mistakes. This willingness was not recklessness, it was acceptance. They understood the stakes. They understood that merchant sailors were dying every day in ships that had no defense against submerged attackers. They understood that their presence over the convoys offered protection that nothing else could provide. They understood that every submarine they detected, every attack they made, every hour of air cover they maintained contributed to a larger effort that would eventually determine the outcome of the war. They did not think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as men doing a job that needed to be done, a job that happened to be dangerous, a job that required them. To fly from a small ship over a vast ocean in search of enemies who preferred darkness and anonymity. The heroism would come later, in the judgment of historians who could see what the men themselves could not see in the moment. In the moment, there was only the mission. The problem facing Allied anti-submarine forces in the spring of 1943 was not a failure of courage or technology. It was a failure of coverage. The Atlantic was simply too large, and the submarines too numerous, and the escort forces too thin. Convoy escort doctrine had evolved through 3 years of painful experience. Surface warships, destroyers, destroyer escorts, frigates, and corvettes provided the primary protection for merchant convoys. They screened the formation, detected submarines with sonar, and attacked with depth charges when contacts were established. They were effective within their operational limits, but those limits were severe. A destroyer could cover only a fraction of the water around a convoy. Its sonar had limited range, typically a few thousand yards under ideal conditions, and ideal conditions rarely existed in the North Atlantic. Its speed advantage over a surfaced submarine was modest, and U-boats had learned to position themselves ahead of convoys, waiting for the formation to come to them rather than pursuing from astern where escorts concentrated. Wolf pack tactics exploited these limitations ruthlessly. A pack of U-boats could spread across the expected path of a convoy, with submarines positioned miles apart, each waiting for the formation to enter attack range. Once contact was established, the first submarine would report the convoy's position, course, and speed to shore headquarters. Other submarines would converge on the reported position. Attacks would begin at nightfall, when surface visibility dropped and radar coverage was limited, when submarines could approach on the surface without being seen. The escorts faced an impossible task. They could not be everywhere at once. They could not see submarines that remained beyond sonar range. They could not prevent infiltration when their numbers were insufficient to establish a defensive perimeter around the entire convoy. They could respond to attacks after they began, hunting for submarines that had already fired their torpedoes and were diving to escape, but response was not prevention. The convoys kept sailing anyway because the alternative was worse. Britain needed supplies. The Atlantic was the only route. The losses were catastrophic but not yet fatal, and so the convoys continued, and the submarines continued hunting them, and the arithmetic of attrition ground forward toward an uncertain conclusion. Aircraft changed this calculation in ways that surface escorts could not. A single patrol aircraft could search thousands of square miles of ocean in a few hours, covering distances that would take surface vessels days to traverse. Its radar could detect surfaced submarines at ranges measured in miles rather than thousands of yards. Its speed allowed it to reach contact points before submarines could dive and escape. Its weapons, depth charges, bombs, and eventually acoustic torpedoes, could attack submarines that had begun diving but had not yet reached safe depth. Most importantly, aircraft forced submarines to submerge. A U-boat on the surface could make 17 knots or more. Submerged, the same submarine was limited to 6 or 7 knots, draining its batteries with every hour of underwater operation. A submarine forced down by aircraft lost its ability to pursue a convoy, lost its ability to communicate with other submarines, lost its ability to position itself for attack. Even if no weapons were dropped, even if no damage was inflicted, the mere presence of aircraft provided protection by denying submarines the surface time they needed to operate effectively. But aircraft needed bases, and bases needed proximity to convoy routes, and the Central Atlantic had neither. The Black Pit existed because physics imposed limits that determination could not overcome. Land-based patrol aircraft of 1942 and early 43 lacked the range to cover the mid-ocean gap. Very long-range liberators could reach part-way into the void, but not far enough, not consistently enough, not in numbers sufficient to provide continuous coverage. The convoys sailed through the gap unprotected from above, and the submarines waited for them there. The escort carrier was the answer to this impossible geometry. By putting a flight deck in the middle of the convoy, Allied planners eliminated the range problem entirely. Aircraft operating from escort carriers could provide continuous coverage throughout a convoy's voyage, regardless of distance from land, regardless of weather conditions over distant shore bases, regardless of the complex logistics of coordinating land-based patrol aircraft with moving ship formations. The concept was not new in early 1943, but its large-scale implementation was. The first escort carrier operations had demonstrated the potential of the approach. HMS Audacity, a British conversion, had proven the value of carrier-based aircraft for convoy defense before being sunk in December 1941. The lessons of Audacity and subsequent British escort carrier operations informed American planning, and, by the spring of 1943, newly completed American escort carriers were entering service in growing numbers. Bogue was among the first to deploy with a fully trained air group specifically configured for anti-submarine warfare. Her mission was not simply to protect convoys, but to prove that escort carriers could close the Black Pit permanently, that the Central Atlantic could become as dangerous for submarines as the approaches to land, that the paradigm of the U-boat war could be shifted by persistent air presence. The burden of this proof fell on the pilots and air crews who would actually fly the missions. They understood the tactical problem. Submarines could dive in less than a minute when alerted. Aircraft attacking from altitude gave submarines warning time measured in precious seconds. Weapons had to be accurate to be lethal, and accuracy required approach angles and release conditions that were difficult to achieve against a moving target that was actively trying to disappear. The solution was aggressive prosecution. When a submarine was spotted, aircraft had to attack immediately, pressing in before the target could submerge, accepting the risk of anti-aircraft fire in exchange for the opportunity to catch the submarine on the surface or at shallow depth. Multiple aircraft had to coordinate their attacks, if available, hitting the submarine from different angles, saturating its defensive capabilities, maintaining pressure until weapons were exhausted or the target was destroyed. This was not the careful, methodical approach that peacetime training emphasized. It was combat. The men of VC-9 had trained for this, but training was simulation, and simulation was not reality. They knew the procedures, they knew the weapon settings, they knew the approach angles and release altitudes that their instructors had calculated as optimal. What they did not know was how they would perform when a real submarine was in their sights, when anti-aircraft rounds were reaching toward their aircraft, when there was no instructor to stop the exercise and offer corrections. They would learn on June 12, 1943. The convoy designated as USS-9 was bound from the United States to the Mediterranean, a large formation of merchant ships carrying supplies for Allied operations in North Africa and the planned invasion of Sicily. Bogue and her escorts joined the convoy's covering force in early June, taking up station where their aircraft could provide maximum coverage over the most vulnerable portion of the route. The weather in the mid-Atlantic was typical for late spring. Variable cloud cover, moderate swells, visibility that ranged from excellent to poor depending on local conditions. The flight deck crews had learned to read the sky with the attention that farmers gave to weather, knowing that cloud ceilings and wind direction could mean the difference between successful operations and grounded aircraft. The patrols began at dawn and continued until darkness made landing too hazardous. Avengers launched at intervals throughout the daylight hours, each crew assigned a search sector radiating outward from the convoy's position. They flew expanding box patterns, their radar sweeping the surface, their eyes watching for the characteristic wake of a submarine running on the surface. Most patrols found nothing. The ocean was vast and submarines were small, and even aggressive search patterns covered only a fraction of the water where threats might lurk. The monotony of empty patrols bred a particular kind of vigilance. Crews learned to maintain attention through hours of featureless flight, knowing that the moment of contact would come suddenly and would require instant response. They developed routines for staying alert. They divided observation duties. They talked through procedures during quiet stretches, reinforcing the actions they would take when something finally appeared. June 12th began like every other day of the patrol. The dawn launch put aircraft in the air as the eastern horizon brightened, Avengers climbing away from Bogue's deck and dispersing to their assigned sectors. The radar sets warmed up and began their sweeps. The crews settled into the familiar rhythm of search and observe, search and observe. Then someone saw something. The contact was visual initially, a disturbance on the water that resolved into the distinctive silhouette of a submarine running on the surface. Range and bearing were estimated, then confirmed by radar. The crew transmitted their contact report, following procedures that had been rehearsed countless times, and began their approach. The submarine was U-118, a Type XB mine layer operating in the Central Atlantic. She was large by submarine standards, nearly 300 feet in length, with a complement of over 50 men. Her primary mission was mine-laying, but she also carried torpedoes and could attack shipping if opportunities presented themselves. She had been at sea for weeks, operating independently, and was on the surface to charge batteries and refresh the air in her compartments. What happened next would become part of the operational history of escort carrier anti-submarine warfare. The first Avenger pressed its attack, descending toward the submarine while the crew prepared their depth charges. The submarine began to dive as soon as lookouts spotted the approaching aircraft. But diving took time, and time was measured in seconds that the aircraft consumed with every 100 feet of altitude lost. The attack run was not textbook perfect. Combat runs rarely were. The pilot had to estimate the submarine's diving rate, predict where the hull would be when the depth charges reached their detonation depth, adjust for wind and aircraft drift, make decisions in moments that training had prepared him for but could not fully replicate. He released his charges and pulled away, watching over his shoulder for the explosions that would tell him whether his geometry had been correct. The depth charges detonated. Water erupted in tall columns, obscuring the area where the submarine had been. Whether damage had been inflicted was impossible to determine immediately. The ocean kept its secrets for long minutes before revealing what lay beneath the disturbed surface. More aircraft arrived as the engagement continued. Bogue had multiple Avengers airborne, and contact reports brought them converging on the position. Each crew made their own attack runs, dropping their weapons on a target that was sometimes visible, sometimes obscured by spray and smoke, sometimes merely a radar return that indicated something was there but gave no indication of what condition it was in. The engagement lasted for extended periods as aircraft cycled through attacks, returned to the carrier for rearming, and launched again to resume the prosecution. The submarine fought back. U-boats of this period carried anti-aircraft armament that had been progressively strengthened as the air threat became more serious. The Type XB mounted multiple anti-aircraft guns, and their crews had been trained to engage attacking aircraft rather than diving immediately. The doctrine was controversial within the German submarine service, with some commanders preferring to fight on the surface against single aircraft rather than risk depth charge attack during the vulnerable diving phase. Rounds reached toward the attacking Avengers. The aircraft were not immune to damage, and their crews knew that a hit in the wrong place could end a mission instantly. They pressed their attacks anyway, accepting the risk as part of the job, understanding that hesitation gave the submarine time, that aggressive prosecution denied it. The coordination between multiple aircraft proved effective. When one Avenger was recovering from its attack run, another was beginning its approach. When one crew exhausted their weapons, others were arriving with full loads. The submarine could not surface to engage aircraft with its anti-aircraft guns without exposing itself to immediate attack. It could not stay, submerged indefinitely without depleting batteries that were essential for survival. The submarine was caught in a trap that closed tighter with each passing hour. Reports reaching Bogue indicated that the engagement was proceeding successfully. that weapons were being delivered accurately, that the submarine was taking damage. The precise extent of that damage remained uncertain until the conclusion became undeniable. U-118 sank. The exact sequence of hits that proved fatal was difficult to determine in the chaos of the engagement. Multiple aircraft had dropped weapons. Multiple detonations had occurred in proximity to the submarine's estimated position. The cumulative effect was destruction. The submarine's pressure hull breached beyond its capacity to maintain depth control, its compartments flooding, its crew unable to arrest the catastrophe that began with the first accurate attack. Survivors were spotted in the water as the engagement concluded. The men of U-1. 18 who had escaped the sinking hull were recovered by escort vessels, becoming prisoners who would spend the remainder of the war in Allied custody. Their rescue was not guaranteed by the circumstances of their defeat, but it was consistent with the rules of war and the humanity that survived even in combat between deadly adversaries. The aircraft returned to Bogue. The pilots and crews were exhausted from hours of intense flying, from repeated attack runs, from the sustained concentration that combat demanded. They landed on the pitching deck, taxied clear of the landing area, and shut down their engines. Debriefings followed, each crew describing their attacks, their observations, their assessment of what had happened and why. June 12, 1943 became a date that commanders and historians would remember. VC-9 had proven that escort carrier aircraft could locate, attack, and destroy a submarine in the mid-Atlantic, in the heart of the Black Pit, where land-based aircraft could not reach and where convoys had previously sailed without air protection. The proof was not theoretical. It was floating debris and captured survivors and a submarine that would never hunt again. The implications extended far beyond a single engagement. The sinking of U-118 was not the result of a single brilliant attack or an individual act of exceptional skill. It was the product of doctrine, training, coordination, and persistence applied by ordinary men who performed their duties effectively under extraordinary circumstances. This distinction mattered because it demonstrated that the success could be replicated. If one escort carrier with one air group could sink a submarine in the mid-Atlantic, then multiple escort carriers with multiple air groups could sink many submarines. The Black Pit could be closed not through heroic exception, but through systematic application of proven methods. The balance of the Atlantic War could shift. The commanders who reviewed the engagement understood what it represented. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, had been pushing for aggressive anti-submarine warfare throughout his tenure. He had advocated for escort carriers, for dedicated anti-submarine task groups, for offensive operations that would hunt submarines rather than merely defend convoys against them. The success of June 12th validated his approach. Bogue continued operations throughout the summer of 1943, and her record continued to accumulate. The air group flew hundreds of sorties in the weeks following the sinking of U-118. They detected additional submarines. They attacked when opportunities presented themselves. They forced submarines to submerge and remain submerged, denying them the surface time essential for effective operations. Whether individual attacks resulted in confirmed kills or merely harassment and disruption, the cumulative effect degraded German submarine operations in the areas where Bogue patrolled. Other escort carriers joined the effort as construction programs delivered new vessels and training programs produced new air groups. USS Card, USS Core, USS Santee, and others deployed to the Atlantic, each adding their aircraft, to the growing coverage that denied submarines sanctuary in the mid-ocean. The Black Pit shrank and eventually disappeared as escort carrier operations became routine rather than exceptional. The statistics told the story. In March 1943, the worst month of the Atlantic War for the Allies, over 600,000 tons of shipping had been lost to submarines. By May, losses had dropped significantly. By summer, the trend had reversed decisively. German submarine losses exceeded replacements for the first time. The exchange rate that had favored U-boats throughout 1942 tilted toward the Allies. Multiple factors contributed to this reversal: improved radar, better intelligence from decoded German communications, more escort vessels, enhanced training for convoy commanders, and changes in German tactics that sometimes worked against submarine effectiveness. But among these factors, the escort carrier stood out as uniquely important because it solved a problem that no other system could address. The mid-Atlantic had been a void that submarines exploited. The escort carrier filled that void with persistent air presence that transformed the operational environment completely. Submarine commanders reported the change in conditions. Patrols that had once found convoys sailing through the Black Pit without air cover now encountered aircraft at all hours of daylight. Opportunities for surface approach and attack disappeared. The tactics that had worked in 1942 became suicidal in 1943. The hunters became the hunted. The men of VC-9 who had participated in the sinking of U-118 did not know the full significance of their achievement in the immediate aftermath. They knew they had sunk a submarine. They knew they had performed their mission effectively. They knew that the engagement had been intense and that their training had served them well. But the larger strategic implications, the shift in the Atlantic balance, the contribution to an eventual Allied victory, these were things that only time and historical perspective could reveal. They returned to their routines: more patrols, more hours of searching over empty ocean, more days of tension punctuated by moments of action. The war continued, and their part in it continued, and the sinking of U-118 became one engagement among many in a campaign that would last until Germany's surrender. What distinguished the men of the escort carrier force was not individual brilliance, but collective competence. They had mastered difficult skills. They had maintained discipline under pressure. They had trusted their equipment, their training, and each other. They had flown missions that carried significant risk and had accepted that risk as the price of doing necessary work. The aircraft they flew were not the fastest or most glamorous machines of the war. The TBF Avenger was a torpedo bomber adapted for anti-submarine work, practical rather than elegant, designed for reliability rather than performance. It could not outrun enemy fighters or perform acrobatic maneuvers. It was a truck with wings, built to carry weapons to targets and bring crews home safely. The pilots who flew Avengers from escort carriers did not become famous in the way that fighter aces or dive bomber pilots achieved fame. Their victories were measured in submarines sunk, convoys protected, merchant sailors who reached port alive because air cover had prevented attacks that would otherwise have succeeded. These were achievements that did not generate dramatic gun camera footage or newspaper headlines. They were achievements of attrition, of denial, of slowly shifting odds in a campaign that lasted years. The sinking of U-118 on June 12, 1943, represented a proof of concept that had implications far beyond the immediate tactical result. It demonstrated that escort carriers worked. It demonstrated that the Black Pit could be closed. It demonstrated that the Atlantic War could be won. The proof would be confirmed repeatedly in the months that followed, as more submarines were sunk, as convoy losses dropped, as the German submarine force bled crews and boats at rates that could not be sustained. The ripple effects of escort carrier anti-submarine warfare extended through the remainder of the Atlantic campaign and beyond. By the end of 1943, the German submarine threat had been contained. Losses continued, Convoys still faced danger, and individual engagements could still prove deadly for merchant sailors and escort crews alike. But the existential crisis had passed. Britain would not starve. The build-up for the invasion of Europe would proceed. The submarines had been defeated, not through a single decisive battle, but through the cumulative effect of thousands of small engagements in which escort carriers played a crucial role. The numbers accumulated relentlessly. Bogue alone was credited with the sinking of multiple submarines during her Atlantic deployments, each kill representing dozens of German submariners lost, each submarine removed from the order of battle representing future convoys that would sail without facing that particular threat. Her air group's performance earned recognition that reflected the effectiveness of their operations. Other escort carriers compiled similar records. USS Escort's air group sank 8 submarines during 1943. USS Core accounted for additional kills. The network of escort carriers patrolling Atlantic convoy routes created an environment where submarine operations became progressively more dangerous, where patrol reports increasingly noted encounters with aircraft, where the Central Atlantic transformed from hunting ground to killing zone. The transformation affected German submarine strategy fundamentally. Commanders who had sent their boats into the North Atlantic with confidence in 1942 began ordering them to other theaters by late 1943. The Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the waters off South America, anywhere that seemed to offer better odds than the Mid-Atlantic where escort carriers ruled. The strategic center of the submarine war shifted, because the escort carriers had made the old center untenable. The tactical innovations that emerged from escort carrier operations influenced anti-submarine warfare for decades. Procedures developed for coordinating multiple aircraft against a single submarine target became standard doctrine. The integration of radar search with visual attack techniques evolved into systematic approaches that later generations would refine further. The operational concepts that Bogue and her sister ships proved in combat shaped the design of subsequent escort carriers and the training of future air crews. The lessons learned had particular relevance for the Cold War that followed. Soviet submarine forces presented a threat that planners understood partly through the lens of the German submarine campaign. The value of carrier-based anti-submarine aircraft, proven in the Atlantic, informed post-war naval development. The lineage that connected the TBF Avengers of 1943 to the anti-submarine aircraft of subsequent decades ran through the operational experience of the escort carrier war. The men who served in VC-9 and similar squadrons contributed to this legacy through their actions and through the records they created. After-action reports, combat narratives, operational analyses, and personal accounts provided the raw material from which doctrine was refined. Their experiences, both successes and failures, became case studies that influenced how future aviators were trained and how future operations were planned. The human cost of the campaign was distributed across both sides. American air crews lost in combat or operational accidents represented skilled men whose training represented significant investment and whose deaths affected families that would live with absence for the remainder of their lives. German submariners lost in boats that escort carrier aircraft destroyed represented similarly skilled men whose deaths were consequences of a strategy that had proven unsustainable against the defenses that the Allies eventually deployed. The moral calculus of the anti-submarine war resisted simple evaluation. Submarines attacked merchant ships that carried civilian crews and sometimes civilian passengers. They sank vessels whose destruction meant drowning for men who had not volunteered for combat. The attacks that escort carrier aircraft made against submarines were strikes against legitimate military targets by the standards of the laws of war, but each attack carried lethal intent against men who were themselves following orders in a conflict they had not started. The men who flew from Bogue did not agonize over these questions in real time. They focused on their missions, their procedures, their responsibilities to each other and to the convoys they protected. The philosophical dimensions of their work were matters for contemplation after the fact, when the urgency of combat had faded and the perspective of time allowed reflection. What survived was the record of what they accomplished. They closed the Black Pit. They helped break the submarine threat. They contributed to a victory that allowed subsequent operations, including the cross-channel invasion of June 1944, to proceed without the supply crisis that would have followed if the submarines had won. This contribution was essential, even if it was not dramatic. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of attrition fought in increments, measured in tonnages, sunk and submarines destroyed, and convoy arrival percentages. It did not produce the concentrated violence of Midway or the Marianas Turkey Shoot. It produced instead a slow accumulation of outcomes that eventually proved decisive. Escort carrier operations were central to this outcome. The sinking of U-118 on June 12, 1943, was one incident among hundreds that collectively reversed the tide of the Atlantic War. It mattered not because it was unique, but because it was representative, a demonstration of what trained crews in effective aircraft operating from purpose-built platforms could accomplish against a submarine threat that had seemed unstoppable. The Atlantic became a killing zone for submarines because men made it so. Decades after the war ended, the Battle of the Atlantic remained a subject of study and reflection. Historians analyzed the campaign's dynamics, identifying turning points and debating counterfactuals. What if the Germans had built more submarines earlier? What if the Allies had deployed escort carriers sooner? What if the code breakers had failed to crack Enigma? The questions multiplied, but the fundamental outcome remained fixed. The Allies had won, and the submarines had lost. And the reasons for this outcome included the escort carriers that had closed the Black Pit. The men who served in VC-9 and similar squadrons aged into veterans, then elderly men, then memories preserved in oral histories and archive collections. Some wrote accounts of their experiences. Some gave interviews to researchers documenting the war. Some preferred silence, finding that the intensity of their wartime service resisted casual description. They had done extraordinary things under extraordinary circumstances, and the passage of time did not diminish the significance of what they had accomplished. Bogue herself served throughout the war and survived into the post-war period. She was decommissioned and eventually disposed of, her hull no longer needed by a navy that had accumulated more carriers than peacetime requirements justified. Her sister ships met similar fates, the entire class eventually passing from active service as newer designs replaced them. What remained was documentation and memory, the record of what these ships and their crews had accomplished. The TBF Avenger continued in service beyond the war that had birthed it. Modified versions served with Navy anti-submarine squadrons into the 1950s, and foreign operators flew the type even longer. The aircraft that had helped win the Battle of the Atlantic proved adaptable to post-war roles, its basic soundness validating the design decisions that Grumman engineers had made when the war was young and its outcome uncertain. The strategic lessons of the escort carrier campaign influenced naval thinking for generations, the value of organic air power for surface task forces, the importance of closing gaps in coverage, the effectiveness of coordinated air and surface operations against submarine threats. These principles, demonstrated in the Atlantic between 1943 and 1945, shaped doctrine and force structure through the Cold War and beyond. The human lessons were less easily codified but equally important. Ordinary men could accomplish extraordinary things when properly trained, equipped, and led. Courage manifested not only in dramatic individual acts, but in the sustained performance of dangerous duties over extended periods. Victory in attritional warfare came from persistence as much as brilliance. The sinking of U-118 had been one engagement on one day in 1 year of a war that lasted 6 years across multiple continents. Its significance lay not in its uniqueness, but in its demonstration of what was possible. A submarine that had threatened convoys would threaten them no longer. A crew that might have sunk merchant ships and killed merchant sailors had been removed from the war. A proof of concept had been established that would be repeated until the threat was broken. The men who flew from Bogue on June 12, 1943, could not have known how their actions would echo through history. They knew only that they had a job to do, that the job was dangerous, and that doing it well mattered. They took off from a pitching deck, searched an empty ocean, found an enemy, and attacked until the enemy was destroyed. Then they landed, debriefed, rested, and prepared to do it again. This was the reality of the escort carrier war. Not glamour, not glory, but relentless application of skill against threat, repeated daily until the threat was neutralized. The Atlantic had been a killing ground for merchant ships and the sailors who crewed them. The escort carriers made it a killing ground for submarines instead. The reversal saved lives that could not be counted, futures that unfolded because ships reached port with their cargoes intact, a war effort that succeeded because supplies flowed instead of sinking. The pilots and air crews who accomplished this transformation deserve remembrance, not because they were exceptional individuals, but because they were representative of a generation that accepted extraordinary burdens and discharged them effectively. They turned the Atlantic into a different kind of ocean, one where submarines died and convoys survived, and in doing so, they helped determine the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. Their legacy is measured in ships that reached port, in campaigns that succeeded, in a world that emerged from the war different than it would have been if the submarines had won. The ocean remembers none of this. The men who flew above it remembered everything.